Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we'll get started in just a minute or two. But I thought I'd kick us off by welcoming everyone to the room and letting you know that this is the first webinar in our 2016-2017 Creating a Blue Dialogue webinar series, and we are in our 7th season. So many of you have attended our webinars in the past, but for those of you who haven't, the goal of these sessions is to bring together water leaders and practitioners in one virtual space and to engage with emerging and priority issues in water policy and water governance. And today, our speakers will share insights on the important elements of a sound water planning process and reflect on experiences in Indigenous-led water planning. And this series wouldn't be possible without the support of our various partners, and all of them are listed here on the slide. So I want to say a big thank you to all of them for their core support to this series. And before I hand things over to our speakers, I wanted to run through a few housekeeping items. So first, I've put a blanket mute on everybody because we're expecting around 75 people today. We wouldn't want to be getting distraction from audio feedback. So everybody is on mute. To deal with questions, we'll use the chat box that's in the bottom right corner of our screen. After our speakers are finished presenting, that's where we'll handle the questions. I'll serve as the moderator and read them out as they come in, and then the speakers will be able to answer them. And then finally, final housekeeping item is that a nice way to feel like we're a community is to share where we are and detail about the weather in your home watershed. So if you'd like to share that in the chat box, that would be great. And also, it'd be great for you to mention if there's others in the room with you. I know that a number of the folks who registered would have a couple people with them in the same room. So now I'd like to introduce today's speakers, and I'm just delighted that we have Lee and Kate with us. I had the pleasure of getting to meet some of the Compass team earlier this year, and I'm really looking forward to Lee's presentation today. Lee is a professional engineer. She's with Compass Resource Management as a principal. She's a decision analyst and facilitator. She's been involved in dozens of policy initiatives and collaborative planning processes for 20 years, so she has a huge breadth of experience and a lot of great insights to share with us today. Kate will have a short presentation today following Lee's talk. Kate is a project manager and research associate with the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. Kate has 12 years of experience working in the environmental field and with Indigenous communities. So Kate will really add a great perspective to our discussion today. With that, we can get started. So I'll hand over the reins to Lee, and a big thank you again for sharing your insights today. So Lee, if you press *6, we should be able to hear you, and you should be able to advance your slides through your presentation.
Okay, this is a test. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you. I want to, first of all, thank Polis for inviting us to do the webinar. And I also want to thank my colleagues, Sally Rudd and Holly Nesbitt, who helped me put together the research and the preparation for today's webinar. I do not have control. Sorry, I'm pausing here. I don't have the control of the slides, so there's a delay. Okay, here we go. Just in terms of an outline, I've got a few slides to set the context for the talk, and then I'll spend 5 or 10 minutes to give an overview of some of the water use planning experience in BC. Most of the webinar will be on a set of top 10 lessons that we think are relevant to various forms of watershed planning. And then we'll end with a few thoughts and questions related to the potential for applying these lessons to water sustainability plans under the new Water Sustainability Act. A word on our perspective. We're practitioners, consultants. Most of our time is spent working with people in groups and working toward consensus on a range of water management problems, including the water use planning process here in BC and a number of other large multi-use rivers throughout Western Canada and the US. In preparation for today, we did reach out to a number of people who were very involved in the water use planning process in BC because we wanted to elicit a broader range of up-to-date perspectives on some of the enduring legacy and lessons of water use planning and how that experience might relate to water sustainability plans. I have to say we got a lot of response from people, and I'm not going to be able to do justice to all of what we heard, but I have embedded a number of their insights into the process. Before we dive in, I think it's useful to note that there are different kinds of planning processes. Often when we talk about the water use planning process, the steps aren't immediately familiar to people. And they don't see how it relates to the planning process that they're involved in. I'm having a lot of trouble with the presentation here. There it is. So anyway, we thought it's helpful to touch on that. Many watershed planning processes that we've seen fall in the category of what, for lack of a better word, we'll call a vision-focused plan. I'm not super happy with that label, but by that we mean the kind of plan that develops a broad, kind of all-encompassing framework for the watershed. It sets direction and context for a broad range of activities. A decision-oriented plan is more focused. It's often driven by one or a few more specific pressing issues, and it's designed to help people make a choice among alternative courses of action, and especially when that choice involves trade-offs and conflicts among different interests in the watershed. Those processes aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, and I hope this slide helps to show what I'm getting at with that. A common situation is that in the course of one of these broader processes, one or two issues rise to the top. It becomes apparent that there's a need for a process to help people make a difficult choice. So the steps you see here on the right are the ones I'm going to talk about today, but it's an approach that can complement rather than replace these broader watershed planning processes. On to water use planning. It's a generic term really for any process for clarifying how to use water in situations where there's multiple users or uses. In British Columbia, we have a particular process. I'm going to just give a really highlight, like a sort of in a nutshell overview of it. Water use planning in BC really emerged out of a long history of conflict, including a number of domestic court cases as well as challenges under NAFTA. And BC Hydro and the province and DFO developed a water use planning program together in response to that. You could say they did it voluntarily, but it was really quite an unprecedented level of urgency around initiating a collaborative process to deal with all of the challenges that were occurring at the time at hydroelectric facilities. The process is widely regarded as a success that's worth reflecting on the outcomes. I'll just do that briefly. Basically, 23 water use plans were developed at hydroelectric facilities between 1998 and 2004. And all of that occurred at about a third the cost of similar relicensing in the US that was going on at the time. There were, I think, a number of weaknesses in the process, but it's fair to say, I think, that it's widely acknowledged that there were a lot of important ecological and social gains and a better balance achieved across all the multiple users in the watershed. Consensus was achieved at all but one of the facilities, and the process was sort of had a high approval rate by participants. It's still seen as a model for water governance, and I'll use this moment just to make a plug for a very excellent report by WWF that really outlines a lot of details around that. So it's worth thinking about, you know, what worked in water use planning and why, and what could we learn from it. Out of all that crisis that I mentioned, there came a really remarkable level of interagency cooperation and leadership. There was a steering committee and a management committee, and they addressed policy and scoping questions related to what would water use plans include and how, you know, what would be in and out of scope. And there were technical teams. There was a fisheries advisory team that shared expertise across agencies and developed, you know, joint methodological advice to help guide technical work. There was a First Nations Water Use Planning Committee that was very actively engaged from the initial design right through the policy and scoping questions, as well as involved in the technical advisory teams. So guidelines were developed, a pilot was implemented, and once it was successfully completed, the program really launched. So that's kind of the overall program. Here are the steps from the guidelines. On the left-hand side there, after initiation, there's steps 2 to 9, the core part of the process, which is really the development of the water use plan. This occurs through a multi-party committee process, including all the affected interests. The process leaves decision-making in the hands of provincial and federal decision makers. You see the approval process there. And then written into the guidelines, they do have steps for monitoring and a periodic plan review so that changes can be made as monitoring information is gathered. The plan development occurred at each of the 23 facilities. The plan development occurred through a process known as structured decision making. Those steps are really the heart of what went on at each of the water use planning tables. So before we go on to the lessons, I think it's helpful to get an idea of how these steps actually played out at each of the water use planning tables. So I'm going to walk through an example just to show you at a very high level how those steps played out. This is not any water use plan in particular. It's a simplified example. It's very typical. And I'm going to whistle through it. I'm not wanting you to get lost in any details. What I want you to get out of this is just a sense of what the committee was involved in at each step of the process. And that will help me to make some of the lessons a little bit more informative for you. Okay, so here we go. The first step is context. This is about scoping and designing the process. The guidelines provided that for the water use plans. But one thing I think is important to cover is who was at the table. And the answer is everyone was at the table. Each water use plan was developed by a consultative committee, usually about 20 members, although there's some variability. And at the table were BC Hydro, the Provincial Fish and Wildlife Reps, DFO, a range of community groups with interest in conservation, recreation, sometimes drinking water, whatever were the issues at the particular watershed, and First Nations. So special attention was paid to how First Nations participated. In most cases, they sat as members of the table. In a few cases, there was a separate and parallel process for them. There were various methods of integrating the two. So the consultative committee was supported in every water use plan by one or more technical committees or working groups. And these working groups were made up primarily of people with technical expertise, but it was open to non-technical members of the committee as well. So it was inclusive, but a key consideration was maintaining a small enough group size and ensuring continuity so that people could really get substantively into the issues. And the process was designed to really enable that depth of engagement and participation. And there was a sort of parallel public process to get more breadth. The next step of the process is a really critical one, defining objectives. The word objective is used in so many different ways. In water use plans, though, they're used to define what matters, and they become the criteria for evaluating alternatives. So, of course, people don't come to the table with clearly structured objectives. They come with issues. And so at every water use planning table, effort went into structuring these, separating means and ends. We would ask people to really focus on why things are important to try to get to fundamental objectives. And we use sort of box and arrow diagrams like this to help everyone get a shared understanding of all the issues and help the group reach agreement on a small number of fundamental objectives or interests that were shared. So here's a typical set of objectives. Each objective has a performance measure, a specific metric for assessing the objective. I think you get the idea. I won't walk through them all. So after setting objectives and defining performance measures, each committee then went on to work on alternatives. And the alternatives, what you see here is the table people used for evaluating alternatives. So the objectives are in the rows, the alternatives are in the columns of this table. It's called a consequence table since it's going to summarize the consequences of each alternative and how it affects each objective. The alternatives in this case were combinations of possible rules for operating the reservoir and possible different kinds of flow releases from the facilities. But I'm hoping you can imagine this framework applied to other kinds of decisions that might be relevant in the watersheds that you're working in. So for example, we've used this kind of a framework. Interesting. We've used this kind of a framework for a variety of other types of decision problems like developing species recovery plans, identifying new sources of community drinking water, developing mitigation options maybe for a development project or identifying restoration projects. So I'm hoping you can think of other cases where this could be applied. So the next step was populating this table. This was an expert task. Experts were either scientists or traditional or other local knowledge holders. And I won't dwell here because the numbers I've made up are, the numbers I've put there are entirely made up just to be illustrative. And then after a couple of rounds of evaluating and refining alternatives, the next step is to focus in on key trade-offs. So here's the typical one. Some people wanted a more stable reservoir because it would produce better riparian habitat in the drawdown zone of the reservoir and wildlife utilization. But that came at the price of impacts to downstream salmon. So this focus on value trade-offs led people to generate creative alternatives to reduce those trade-offs. In this case, I'm actually drawing on the experience from the Bridge River system, and the consultative committee in that case came up with an alternative to do some planting in the drawdown zone to get the gains in riparian vegetation without losing downstream salmon habitat. So they managed to offset the trade-off somewhat and managed to reach agreement on this operation. So this kind of thing happened at every table in some way. People were able to explore a range of alternatives. They had to face trade-offs. And it wasn't always money or power versus fish or environmental issues either. It was fish versus wildlife or one species of fish versus another. People learned throughout the process. It was partly technical learning, but also learning about other people's values and how they viewed the trade-offs. So opinions and preferences changed throughout the course of the process, and that ultimately was really key to reaching agreement. Finally, what did these agreements include? The agreements at each water use plan consisted of three primary things. First, as you would expect, was rules for how water was used, which is what it was really intended to do. But the second thing was physical works in lieu of water use changes. So as in the case of the planting that I just described, if there were physical works that were cheaper and better than changing how water was used, these could be included. And there were monitoring plans. Every water use plan had a considerable amount of uncertainty to deal with. And when those were big enough to affect decision making, they became candidates for long-term monitoring and adaptive management. So that's what happened at the table. Sort of giving you one story, and what happened next was just hit repeat. So that's really how 23 water use plans were done in 6 years. So I know that was a little bit longish, but I think it's going to let me now go through pretty efficiently through the next lessons, and hopefully in a way that's a little bit more meaningful for you. So here we go. We have 10 lessons. The first one is the importance of confirming the link between your planning process and a decision maker. You need to know that someone's listening. So water use plans succeeded because there was a clear decision to be made, namely changes to a water license. There was a clearly identified decision maker, the water controller, who was engaged and was committed to listening to the recommendations. Number 2, bound the scope. So although water use plans are sometimes criticized for their limited scope, they really only were intended to address water use only. Anything related to land-based activities were out of scope. These limits were also identified as the very reason that there were tangible on-the-ground changes and successes. So in addition to firm scope limits, I should mention water use plans also operated within a budget cap that was defined by the decision maker, the province. It wasn't a cap at each table, but it was an overall cap on the program. And so this helped to manage expectations and ensured that the committees were considering options that the decision maker was prepared to approve. Number 3, use a structured and rigorous process. The 6-step structured decision-making process used in water use planning is widely credited with keeping people at the table, keeping the process on track, ensuring there was a sound technical information base, and supporting people in reaching consensus. So the next few lessons that I'm going to go through are related to the process, but I just want to say that they're quite specific steps. They're increasingly recognized as best practices for decision making, particularly public decisions where the bar for defensibility and transparency is quite high. So the images on the slide are really just intended to show that there is some literature on it and standards of practice, and some organizations, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in particular, who are quite committed to using it. One of the key distinguishing features of this process is that it provides equal emphasis and rigor to the treatment of both facts and values. So facts are really answering the question, what will happen if? They're the information base for understanding consequences of proposed actions. Values drive the answer to the question, what should we do given what we know? And the water use planning process certainly demanded sound science and technical base, but it also had expectations about how people talked about their preferences. And so when people said that they preferred a certain alternative, then they needed to be open and transparent about the trade-offs that they were making when they had that preference, and have that conversation with people around the table about why they thought a particular trade-off was justified. So there was a lot of very sort of focused conversation about values and trade-offs. One of the things that a good planning process needs to pay attention to is who does what. We want to use the knowledge of experts to give us information about consequences, but we want to make sure that non-technical participants are able to make informed value judgments. I know that most of you on this call would understand this issue quite well, but we do still see a lot of over-reliance on technical experts, and we often see technical advisory committees who are asked to prepare recommendations on a recommended management strategy that in fact involves important value trade-offs, and so it's just a bit of a watch out for. And one of the challenges in environmental decision making is that the content of the discussions can quite quickly become very technical. And if that happens in an undisciplined way, pretty soon it's the people with the technical expertise doing all the talking and having all the influence. Not through any fault of their own, it's just something that happens. So one of the things that water use plans did really well was level the playing field between expert and non-expert participants. And one of the keys to this was that technical information was communicated quite effectively so that non-technical people could still make very informed value judgments. And one way to do that was really how information was organized into the objectives and performance measures. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. The next lesson is really the importance of agreeing on what matters. What are the things that we care about that could be affected by the alternatives under consideration? And it needs to include all the key interests, even the ones that are difficult to quantify. So, we had fish and wildlife and power and things like that, but some water use plans also had less tangible things like cultural or spiritual quality of a particular area. And those were included, and that helped to keep people at the table. Everyone needs to agree on what matters and what will be considered, but importantly, they don't need to agree on weights or relative importance of the objectives. So that's a common pitfall With the diversity of interests around the table, it's almost impossible to get that kind of agreement. But the good news is people can and do regularly agree on solutions, even when they disagree quite profoundly about the importance of objectives. The second part of this lesson is attaching specific and understandable measures of performance to each objective. And here's where much of that leveling of the playing field occurs. So here's just one example. Oops, I guess I need to click again. The thing that matters in this case is reservoir productivity, which is a function of a whole number of complex processes. But the technical committee synthesized these multiple processes and modeling into a single measure that reports in hectares the area of the reservoir that functions effectively as habitat. So this is a metric that anyone can understand with a bit of context and make informed value judgments about the importance of losses or gains. So quite a bit of work went into this, and most people found that it was, really quite central to the quality of the discussions that happened. Number 6 is the importance of exploring a wide range of alternatives. This sounds fairly simple, it is, but it's quite important. Every water use plan went through 3 or 4 rounds of refining alternatives. And one of the important messages is that there aren't any shortcuts. People won't make hard trade-offs. They won't accept that they have to make hard trade-offs if they think that there might still be that silver bullet alternative out there that will solve everything. And so going through and allowing people to explore a range of alternatives is really important. Number 7 is the importance of building a shared understanding of consequences. And I've got 3 points I want to make here. The first is the need to commit to evidence-based decision making. And I'm using that term because it encompasses both science and traditional knowledge. So in the diagram at the right, it shows all the hypotheses about factors affecting, in this case, abundances of bull trout. And the pathways in black were generated through scientific studies and data. And the pathway in red was generated from traditional knowledge. So there was a real emphasis in water use planning on using all relevant sources of information. Maybe a mixed record of success, but there certainly was effort there and some successes. The second point I want to make is about the importance of the word shared. The consultative committee was charged with agreeing on the selection of experts and the methods of analysis with input from the technical committees. And then they committed to use that information in the consequence table as the basis for the decision. So this largely avoided the problem of any participants kind of undercutting the process in late stages by bringing forward opinions or studies from competing experts. And the third point I want to make is that the analysis can and should be scaled to reflect the stakes, what's at risk. And your resources, frankly. So in many cases in BC's water use planning process and elsewhere, performance measures were simple scales, 1 to 5, assigned by expert judgment. And that was sufficient and appropriate to inform the choices at hand. So you don't have to always do state-of-the-art analysis. The general structure of defining objectives and performance measures and setting up a consequence table is useful even when you're not able to do detailed technical analysis. Okay, number 8. One of the big objections we often hear about this kind of process is the emphasis on trade-offs is negative. What people want is win-wins. We don't want those nasty trade-offs. I think that one of the things that water use plans taught us is that it's possible to have a productive, disciplined, and really sort of grown-up conversation about values, and specifically about difficult value-based trade-offs. So a good process is going to minimize trade-offs because it'll produce creative alternatives. But what people said at the time and continue to say today is that it was that learning about and acceptance of trade-offs that led to broad support for hard choices. Number 9, there were many uncertainties, and some of them really mattered. Not all of them, but some of them did. When there was a significant uncertainty in expected consequences, and when those uncertainties made it difficult to select a preferred alternative with confidence, then those uncertainties became candidates for long-term monitoring to inform predictions, to confirm predictions about outcomes. So I can say with absolute confidence that there would not have been consensus at 22 facilities without a real meaningful walk the talk commitment to adaptive management. And this has turned out to be one of the enduring legacies of water use planning in BC. It's contributed to improved understanding and ability to more effectively manage water in the future. However, there's a few lessons learned. And the first one is ban wishful thinking. Monitoring in ecological systems is really hard. Unless there's a significant management change accompanied by a very significant and long-term investment in monitoring, effects are going to be really difficult and sometimes impossible to detect. So quick and dirty monitoring studies are probably a waste of money. We're better off focusing on the things that we actually can measure a difference on. My chart at the right here is really just demonstrating this. The blue line is the real long-term trend. But if you were only monitoring for the, I think it's 15 years in the middle, where the green line is, you would be getting a very different message about the actual trend. Related to this is the reality that monitoring studies tend to produce lines of evidence rather than conclusive determinations. So it's been very important and helpful that the water use planning program, the monitoring programs were designed collaboratively, so with the regulators and BC Hydro, and in some cases community members were involved. So this has reduced debate about potential flaws in design and allowed the parties to focus on collaboratively interpreting the results. And finally, adaptive management is long, it's hard, and it's expensive to do. And unless it's a legal requirement, it risks being dropped. So if you want it to last, get it made into a legal requirement. And last but not least, what this slide should start with, and I neglected to put it on the slide, is that a consensus agreement is a great thing. It's a very powerful thing for a group interested in change to have. It's very difficult for a decision maker to ignore an agreement that represents a consensus of all the affected parties. So it's a great goal, but as a general rule, there's also good reasons it shouldn't be a requirement. A few of them are there. At the simplest level, it gives away power to individuals in the process. So there'd be different people in the group who have different personalities, negotiating skills, and sort of propensities to compromise, I guess. If consensus is required, then you may end up with decisions that are really, they may deviate from the overall public interest. So of course there's exceptions. If there's been an explicit agreement for shared decision making, then of course there must be a consensus. But in water use plans, participants were asked to seek consensus and then report areas of agreement and disagreement to the decision maker. Okay, this is number above all, kind of synthesizing comment, and it draws really on a lot of the comments that I've made so far. I think above all, what made water use planning work was creating space and time for people to learn together. It's a long conversation. So people learn something at one meeting, they need to go home and reflect on it. It may be in conflict with what they did before they came to the meeting. They may need to talk to their colleagues and friends. But that kind of learning, when it occurs, it leads to real mind-changing conversations and ultimately long-term support for what might be very hard choices. So I think that overall, the WEP experience and the fact that there's, right now in BC, there's dozens of individuals and organizations and institutions that have this experience and learning gained from water use planning, and I think that hopefully bodes well for the quality of public discourse in BC. I think I'm stalled on that. There we go. Okay, that's probably a good segue into challenges, of which there are many that have been identified and would be interesting to comment on. But I did limit myself to two that kind of rose to the top of the pile. Let me just move on. So the first one is the time required to do not just water use planning, but really any kind of substantive watershed planning process. It can take a long time. It's a big investment. So I asked people, what are some of the factors that keep people at the table? And I'm going to link this back to good process guidelines. which kept people feeling at every meeting moved along. We made tangible progress at each meeting. And also link it back to the engagement of the decision maker. So people believed that something was going to change, and so they felt empowered. They felt like, yeah, it's a big investment, but something's going to change. So it's reinforcing the importance of that link back to a very tangible decision that's going to change as a result. All of that said, I don't want to understate, the really enormous investment that this is, particularly for community members, and I'm sure that you all experience that in your own watershed planning processes. The second challenge there it is. The second challenge is related to trust. There's really an interesting question here. How do you make progress when people don't trust each other? And I think the conventional wisdom would say you need trust to make progress. But I want to pose a competing hypothesis based on WUP experience, and that is that people can build trust by making progress. And that WUP really was an example of that. In the beginning, people didn't know or like or trust each other. But largely on the strength of working together through a structured process, making progress toward an endpoint and learning together, trust was one of the important outcomes of the water use planning process. That was it. That was the top 10 plus a couple of challenges. Now I do have just a couple of comments on what makes a good plan and then one slide about water sustainability plans. So I'm getting close to the end here. These are some elements of a good plan as opposed to a planning process, and I don't think it's not all of them, but a few things here worth noting. One is to the extent that you can have the plan containing actions that are concrete and enforceable, then clearly there's strength in that. The second thing is a clear statement of all the key values that were considered and indicators of performance. The third one's an interesting one, and that is actually having predicted outcomes. So if you've got some recommended actions in your plan, there should be some statement of the expected outcomes from them. What do we think we're going to achieve? And that's partly because it's what contributes to learning and to accountability. So if you don't have that, then it's hard to demonstrate any accountability. And related to that is having transparent trade-offs. So it's a good idea to include those in your plan, to be very clear about what you've accepted and why, and maybe including a consideration of the alternatives that were considered. And that helps in communicating the rationale for the plan, but it also helps to retain support for the plan over time. Monitoring and adaptive management plan should have not just research questions, but management questions. What's going to change as a result of the learning that we think we're going to get? Realistic monitoring programs, clear triggers for what would trigger a party to take action or review the plan, and focusing on priorities, which is related to what I mentioned earlier. And the last thing is review and oversight provisions. So for implementing and interpreting monitoring results and revisiting decisions. So again, these are things that tend to get forgotten over time. So the more they can be firm and written into the plan, and really acknowledging the fact that the interpretation of monitoring results is not as straightforward as we might like it to be. Okay, if I get this back, I can do the very last thing. So just a word about water sustainability plans then. I suspect there's people on the phone here who know quite a bit more about this than I do. But I'll just cover a little bit in case there's a few people that aren't familiar with it. The Water Sustainability Act contains a number of sections that make provision for water sustainability plans. Water sustainability plans can be initiated by the minister, and they're intended to address conflicts. They're broader than water use plans. They can address water quantity and allocation concerns, but also water quality, watershed restoration concerns. They're quite permissive and inclusive. And they're specifically intended to address the impacts of land-based activities. They're area-based plans that would be implemented via regulation. That could include regulations about water quality, environmental flow needs, water quantity, a number of things. So my final comments about these are really shaped by the fact that everyone that we talked to has indicated they feel that the WUP process is a good model for water sustainability plans, not necessarily a cookie cutter kind of thing, but a model with some lessons. And that makes sense. Water sustainability plans are a really, really powerful tool. Once developed, they would be presented to Cabinet for approval. They would have the force of regulations behind it and possibly overriding other regulations. So something like that is going to need to be the product of a very rigorous technical and consultative process. So there's lots of things to think and talk about, and I've just selected a few that focus on a subset of the challenges or questions raised about how the WUP experience could be useful for water sustainability plans. This is not actually the slide I expected to see. That's okay. So the first issue is around drivers and demand. Water use plans were driven really by that sort of perfect storm of conflict and public mistrust and legal challenges. A lot of people are wondering what will trigger a water sustainability plan. And related to that, when is a water sustainability plan the best tool? Because of course there's other tools. There's provision for area-based plans under the Environmental Management Act, for example. So I think community groups will want guidance on that from the province. Under what conditions is a water sustainability plan envisioned as a good tool, and what will it take to trigger one? Capacity for multi-party collaboration for the water use planning, as I mentioned, multi-party leadership was really quite instrumental. And the level of collaboration at the policy and the technical level was impressive. So I guess the question is out there, do different levels of government have the motivation and the capacity to provide that for water sustainability plans? Another issue is the diversity of issues addressed. There's a lot of similarities between water use plans and water sustainability plans, but an important difference is the diversity of issues addressed or anticipated to be addressed under water sustainability plans. WUPs were efficient largely because they had, as I mentioned, firmly bounded scope, but also replication. The water sustainability plans can be firmly bounded, and it seems to be stated in the Act that limits can be put on them. But they wouldn't benefit from replication, at least not to the same degree, not at the technical level, because of the diversity of issues they're likely to address. On the other hand, one would expect that maybe the process could be replicated. The WUP process guidelines were central to its success, and the plan development process for water sustainability plans is largely unspecified right now, but each plan would likely need its process guidelines, and the WUP guidelines could provide a useful guide for that. Funding. So the rigor in both process and analysis was central to the success in water use plans, but does require resources. Not all water sustainability plans might be as complex as some of the WUPs and might not require that level of resources. But it's worth noting that water use plans were implemented by a well-resourced proponent, and there was a funding and compensation mechanism to sort of keep them whole through that process. So I think the question is out there, how will water sustainability plans be funded? And finally, First Nations participation, and I'll just leave that as an open question, really. I think water use plans were pretty successful by the standards of the day, but there's a very new landscape out there for First Nations, and I think it's an open question and clearly would be key to the success of water sustainability plans to work that out. So I think that's it, and I'm going to stop there and say thanks for thanks for listening, and I think I'll be turning over to Kate now, or back to Natasha.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks for your great presentation. And I think you're absolutely right that as watershed planning is something that's of growing interest in BC, it's really, really useful to get into the meat of these questions around trade-offs and values and how to design that really inclusive process. So thank you so much for your presentation. And I think you provided a nice segue there with your final reflections on the role of First Nations in planning processes. And I think Kate can really pick up on that in her presentation about Indigenous-led watershed planning processes. So Kate, if you can *6 to unmute yourself.
I have, and I'm here.
Great. Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. So just thank you to Polis for the opportunity to be here today, and Lee for your insightful presentation. I won't be talking for as long as Lee did. I will just provide like a 10 to 15 minute presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions. So my name's Kate, and I work at the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. We're a nonprofit organization. We work with First Nation communities all across Canada on different environmental issues that they're dealing with. So I'm happy to be here today to talk about some of the work that we've done and my experiences working with communities over the past 12-ish years. So I should have, yeah, there we go. So at CEAR, we think it's critical that First Nations play a more significant role in regional watershed planning processes in order that all critical rights and interests can be heard and that common visions for the future can be articulated. And this is really critical in order to meaningfully, equitably, and sustainably address water challenges that are being faced in their region. So it was about 5 years ago that CEAR secured funding through our BC Blue Water Project to develop a First Nations tool that would help close this gap. And so we created a series of watershed planning guidebooks to guide First Nations in creating a process of watershed management strategies that's unique to their community's needs, relationships, and rights. So this process, it helps communities to create a plan to protect the rivers or lakes in their community, or to get involved in an existing or lead a new watershed planning process. So why we created these tools? So there are a few important reasons. So water plays a vital role in our lives, we all know that, and in our survival. And the cultural and spiritual relationship that First Nations have with water is very unique. And this was part of the reason why we started on this path. And it was also because water-related planning was starting to take more precedence across the country, and most were going forward without First Nations or with very limited First Nation involvement in their planning processes. And lastly, that there are two water myths in Canada, that there's an abundance of water and that we tend to manage water very well. So our approach is quite different from other watershed planning processes because it's First Nations views and values that are related to water that set First Nations-led watershed planning and management on a different path than is typically taken. So as this quote expresses, water is not only a source of life for all living things and essential to both physical and cultural survival, but it is alive and a spirit. And this viewpoint itself changes the very nature of the planning process. The goal is not about the management of a resource, but the protection and use of another spirited life. So what is watershed planning about? It's about understanding all the environmental, social, economic, and cultural elements that affect the watershed and creating a collective vision for the future of the waters and land. And there are many layers to watershed planning, and there are a lot of other initiatives taking place in the area of water planning. So for example, source water protection, stormwater management, or community education around water. So ideally, your watershed plan will include these various elements of good water planning. And a watershed plan could include a range of issues you may want to address and how you'll be addressing them. And these issues could be something like nutrient management, wetland and riparian management and protection, could be resource development, biodiversity and habitat protection, or environmental or in-stream flows. So what's involved in the watershed planning process? So when we developed the guidebook, we created a framework that develops and forms the conceptual basis for the integrated First Nation watershed planning toolkit. And it has 5 key elements that are listed here on the slide. I'm going to read through those. The process itself is quite flexible, and while it can be implemented in a fairly linear fashion in a step-by-step process, the steps, activities, and dialogues can actually cycle back and forth. They can build and grow, and they can be repeated as is often needed in the planning process. Sometimes communities coming into this process might be at a different stage than another community, or they may have done components or elements of one of these processes, but they need to step back and go back to another step to build upon that first. So for today, just because of the limited time, and I thought I would just talk about a few of these elements. So I'm just going to reflect on the first 3. I'm going to briefly talk about a few of the components. In particular, I'm trying to pull out ones that reflect upon the presentation that Lee has just provided. And I've decided more to focus on the process towards developing the plan versus the actual components of the plan itself. So that first one, describing your approach, know yourself, your community's voice. So the planning process involves is to understand your approach to watershed planning at the community level. And this includes gathering people from your community, gathering and incorporating Indigenous knowledge, understanding your community's governance structure and your protocols and your laws and your rights, and identifying your community's visions and values. So it's really important to take time to develop and understand your First Nations approach or your community's approach to watershed planning, and to identify ways that the community relates to others and to the land and waters. And it's this community engagement process that will lead to building a solid foundation of values, governance, and community cohesion to ensure you're bringing your community or First Nations perspective into all stages of watershed planning and makes for more easier implementation. We often hear, and we hear a lot about it, about co-governance, and that First Nations aren't, some First Nations just aren't ready to sit at a table, I think, and talk about co-governance, and part of this is because there is a need for more internal time for communities to understand what their approach is and what their values are and what their vision is and what their goals are, and to bring their community members together to do that. So one of the key components of an Indigenous-led watershed plan for First Nations is to include different knowledge systems. And so both Indigenous knowledge and Western science are important. And Indigenous knowledge in particular is an excellent resource for information about watershed processes and management. And for First Nations, that watershed planning process can be seen as an opportunity to use and or to strengthen Indigenous knowledge in their community and share the importance of this knowledge with other stakeholders. So the second element in the framework is building partnerships and collaborative relationships. So why is it important to build relationships? There's not one group or government that can care for the water or the watershed alone. So it's important that we build relationships with other groups that will be involved in the planning process, with the groups that have an interest in and an impact on the watershed. And depending on the region within your watershed or the watershed within your region, they'll just vary in terms of who those partners will be and the size and the number of the partners you will have. Establishing good relationships in a regional planning process involves developing trust and respect for each other, reaching consensus on how you will work together, and identifying areas of commonality and reducing conflict, which will all lead to better ensuring your plan is implemented and sustained. There are several benefits of developing partnerships, such as having access to resources, for example, financial and technical, or sharing and learning new approaches and solutions to problems, and increasing your network, which can lead to more support for the development of your watershed plan. And the third element I wanted to talk about was knowing your watershed. So this involves identifying the different local challenges that facing water in your region and understanding how the lands and waters are being used within your community. So part of this process could involve writing a state of the watershed report. So on the left-hand side there of the screen, you'll see that there are two boxes that have different checklists. This is a draft table of contents of what a state of the watershed report might look like. So the state of the watershed report could be used as a benchmark, and this is to set out current measures of the watershed health to use as a baseline in the future to evaluate if the actions undertaken as part of the watershed plan are benefiting the watershed or not. It can also be used to confirm and explain more about concerns raised by community members and add more detail to the challenges facing the watershed. But it can also provide an opportunity to work with other stakeholders in your watershed to develop that report and start building those relationships. I also wanted to just touch on the boundaries and deciding on a boundary for a watershed plan, which is a question that we often get and that people often have. How big should it be? What water and land should be included? The boundaries of a watershed plan, they could include, for example, the boundaries used by an existing watershed planning process that's taking place in the region. Or it could be the traditional territory, the treaty territory, and a reserve boundary, as these are the areas of legal or cultural or economic and historic significance. Or it could be the special areas that are of concern to a First Nation or community, or an area that's under serious threat, for example. So that's just that image on the right-hand side is just some different mapping ways of mapping your boundary or figuring out what your boundary are. These images are from the guidebooks that we developed, and I have a link at the end of the presentation if you'd like further information. I just wanted to highlight a few lessons that come to mind for me from watershed planning, and these are ones that I've learned through processes that I've been involved in, or just advice that I've been given from other First Nations and other non-First Nations folks that I've worked with or been engaged with regarding watershed planning. So the first one is to build and maintain community motivation. So the process of understanding values and developing a vision of the watershed will generate excitement and energy, and it'll help keep people motivated through what will likely be a very long-term planning process. So identifying common critical concerns and issues will help you generate interest and momentum. For a First Nation, maybe considering you start a watershed planning group in the community. So by doing this, you're going to identify some key people that will be involved in the day-to-day activities of the planning process. So this might be folks who are passionate about water or planning, who's on staff and has the time or interest to participate in a water planning group. Are there any informal leaders who has the education, the historical and Indigenous knowledge? These are all questions you might consider when bringing people together to start a watershed planning group that'll help keep momentum and keep the process going. Second lesson I just wanted to reflect upon is that the process is often as important as the final product. So establishing relationships takes time. Lee and I have both talked about that. It's really important to create that space that's needed to build trust and mutual understanding. And this space that's needed and the time required will vary from region. It really depends on a number of different factors. It might be based on the history that's there, the capacities of the communities to come together, the interest, and the existing relationships that might be there. And you know what, when it comes to relationships, what I've learned, it might just mean starting with a cup of tea. It might just mean getting together to listen and learn from each other. And it might just be a one-on-one and picking up the phone and saying, can I meet you for coffee? And can we just chat? And can we get to learn about each other and share our story? That space needs to be there to do that, I think, in order to make watershed planning successful and sustainable. And the last lesson is to understand, and of course there are more lessons than what I have here. I've just picked three that I wanted to talk about. It's to understand capacity and resource needs to engage in a watershed planning process. So establishing a watershed planning process and a plan, it takes time and it takes resources. It requires a commitment that may affect other activities and needs in the area or in the area. It's important to be clear about what the resources, so time, money, people, that people have in the planning process to commit to watershed planning. So in my experience, First Nations often lack a lot of human, financial, and technical resources to engage in watershed planning, and that can be a restriction for maintaining those relationships and keeping that process going. So it needs to be really clear, and people need to be upfront and need to share what their needs are, and there needs to be a commitment to find resources to fulfill those needs in order to make the watershed planning process successful. But it doesn't always apply just to First Nations either. There's a lot of NGOs, just like FEAR, out there that don't have core funding, and so they need financial support in order to be part of a process that they really want to be part of, but they need some support in order to do that. I just wanted to leave you with one example from our guidebooks, and this is from the East Coast. It's with the Unamaki Institute for Natural Resources. They are one of our partners on the development of the guidebook, and it's the development of the Collaborative Environmental Planning Initiative. So this was established in 2003. It arose in response to First Nations chiefs to develop an environmental management plan for the lakes and watershed lands. And CEPI, the short form there, organizational model, it includes a steering committee, a management committee, there's task teams, there's a MICMA, elder advisor, an elders council, and a senior council. So it's quite an inclusive process. In 2004, they developed a charter, and this was to guide the participants in developing a vision for the future of the Brass Door Lakes. So this is it here on the left-hand side. And this was signed by federal and provincial government agencies, the chiefs of 5 First Nations, and the wardens and mayors from surrounding counties and municipalities. And it provides a simple and documented confirmation of the commitment of all parties to the CEPI purpose and activities. And then subsequently in July of 2011, the Spirit of the Lake Speech document was completed. And this is a vision for the protection and sustainability of the Brass Door Lakes and its watershed. And it sets guiding principles for decision-making and action. And if you're interested in reading it, you can Google that, and you will get the Spirit of the Lake Speak. It's an excellent document, really interesting. And I just find it provides a way forward for the governments and First Nations to maintain trust and transparency and cooperation while they follow their mandates in protecting the Brass Door Lakes watershed. So just one example that some people may be interested in reading up on. And I'll leave it at that so that we can leave some time for questions. And I guess I will turn it over. That link there at the bottom, folks, is for the Watershed Planning Guidebooks, and we've developed some short 2-pagers of each of the guidebooks, and you can download them from that site so you can get a sense of the themes and topics that are within those guidebooks.
Thanks very much, Kate. And again, thank you, Lee, too. I think we've gotten 2 really excellent sets of insights and perspectives around watershed planning, and I definitely saw some really strong themes. I'm sure others have picked up on that as well, around the need for relationships, co-learning, and resources and time as essential elements in developing a watershed plan. And Kate, I thought it was very useful to help us focus on the fact that there's some initial foundation building that might need to happen in order for a First Nation or another group to meaningfully engage in or lead a planning process. So thank you again to both our speakers, and we have some time now for questions. So I'd welcome people to use the chat box to enter their questions. I can then relay them to the speakers, and I will make my best efforts to not miss any of the questions as they come through here. I see that Nelson is typing. Hi, Nelson. Maybe to get us started while folks start typing their questions, something I wanted to ask a little bit more about, Kate, is from your perspective and experience, the challenges in integrating different knowledge systems in a planning process. We talked about that a little bit as well, and how the BC WUPS process tried to integrate those knowledge sources. Could you reflect a little bit more from your experience how that can happen in a respectful and effective way?
Sure. So I guess there's two things that would come to mind. One would be around engagement of elders and appropriate knowledge holders in the watershed planning process, and that's right from the beginning. So if you're establishing a First Nations watershed planning group, a First Nation community, if they're establishing that group within their nation, that they have the appropriate elders on their committees to help guide that. I often have heard that First Nations, in terms of Indigenous knowledge, that it becomes the foundation for watershed planning and their process for moving forward. I know there's a lot of folks that talk a lot about traditional laws and how they inform watershed planning processes and management or protecting lands and waters. So I think that's one critical point. The other piece would be around, which Lee talked a bit about in terms of like community-based monitoring and gathering data, that if community-based monitoring becomes a component of your watershed plan and your process, that there's opportunity to gather both Indigenous knowledge and Western science knowledge if there's an interest from the community or from other stakeholders, and bringing those knowledge systems together. That's not an easy it's not an easy thing to do, I think, bringing those knowledge systems together, but I think if people start talking about that from the beginning, they will find ways of doing
that. And Lee, reflecting on your experience, do you think, I mean, have you seen some of that in practice in some of the processes you've been part of?
Yes, we've seen some really good successes. One of the things that that we do is just be careful with our language, and simple things like talking about an evidence-based process, and talking about experts and including different kinds of people in your definition of an expert, right? And there's not just Western scientists who are experts, but experts are from communities as well. And so we used a lot of those. What I showed in the presentation was the impact pathway diagram, or sometimes we call it a hypothesis diagram. And it shows what do we believe about how the system works. And by tracing it out visually like that, then all of the hypotheses get put on the table and treated in an equitable way, that it's sort of explored in terms of how relevant are they to this decision process, and how reliable are they. And you ask those questions in different ways depending on the source of the knowledge. But we've had really good success with groups kind of working together on that to make sure that all of the relevant information is being brought forward.
Thanks, Lee. So I'm going to go to Nelson's question, which I think still is picking up on these questions of knowledge and science and building relationships. So Nelson's commented that in the Okanagan there's been some excellent success with applying project charters. So that's to Lee's point about building trust through some of those small successes. Those project charters is one of those places where that plays out. And Nelson's question is, developing good science has been helpful to support planning processes. How important is it to develop good science before or through a planning process? So maybe Lee, you want to respond to that first.
Sure. Yeah, it's always good to have good science at the beginning of a process, but there's a balance, because if you're engaged in a decision process, then sometimes the information that you need to get, the science you need to get, can The amount that you need to get can be scoped down by focusing in on the actual decisions that you need to make. So it's good to go into a process and really identify what are the choices that you need to make, what actions are under consideration, and what information do you need to help you decide which action to take. And that tends to lead you to collecting different information than if you're just doing baseline studies in the absence of thinking about the actions that you're contemplating. So I think baseline information is important, but I just would put it out there that there is a balance there. And you can really sort of narrow and focus the information that you need to collect if you're doing it thinking about what actions am I contemplating, what information do I need to evaluate the pros and cons of those actions.
Thanks, Lee. And I think the second question is directed specifically at you as well. So what was the issue with the 23rd, what that consensus could not be gained?
Yeah, that's the obvious question, isn't it?
Yeah, it was definitely, I think, we definitely, I think, all wanted to know that one.
So I wasn't involved in that water use plan, but it's actually nicely summarized in that WWF report, and I have talked with people about it. So I think what I can say is that what they lost in that water use planning was the co-learning. They lost continuity, and they didn't have the same people at the table from the beginning through to the end. And the people who were there at the end needing to make hard trade-offs weren't there at the beginning when some of the lessons were being learned, alternatives explored, and sort of key understanding of the system being developed. So they lost the continuity, they lost the quality of the learning together. And that's why I guess I really wanted to emphasize that. I think it's not enough just to learn and know and understand the processes in the watershed. It's the importance of doing that together.
Thanks, Lee. This question, I think, is a little bit more directed to Kate, so it's from Jillian. She's asking, have you seen examples where First Nations or other communities have done their own plans before coming forward to a joint table, as has happened in marine planning? And actually, that's probably a question we would have insights on as well, but Kate, maybe you want to take the first crack at that.
Yeah, Lee, I don't know if you have examples kind of from BC or from your experiences, but I would say we've recently completed with this kind of in the final stages of finishing it up and establishing a communication plan, but a BC systematic review of water and water-related initiatives, and this was in partnership with the First Nations Fisheries Council. And through that, we were able to do a bit of a desktop study of First Nations, like water plans and watershed plans and other water-related planning initiatives. And that information will be available in the coming weeks. And so that might provide Julian an opportunity to kind of find some information there that might answer your question. Off the top of my head, sorry, right now I'm not thinking of a community aside from the example that I gave during my presentation from out east, the Unamaki Institute in Tepi. But I'm imagine there may be a few. The difficulty we did find was finding. It may be known that there is one, but getting information or getting the documents or further information on that was difficult. Like First Nations don't have a lot of capacity, and in terms of doing the work that we did, we didn't have a lot of capacity or time to go in depth into the list of plans that we found to do further research on that. So sorry, it's not like a clear-cut answer for you.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I think there's a number of examples in northern parts of British Columbia. The Ngadle-Wet'en First Nation has developed a really innovative approach to defining and articulating water strategies and values, laws. So think there are some really unique examples out there, and that's actually going to be one of the major focus areas at the upcoming Watershed 2016 event as well. And I wanted to note that when I share the summary of this webinar, I'll also share some of the resources, the ones that Lee mentioned, the WWF report, and if it's available at that time, the First Nations Fisheries Council report as well. So we'll make those resources available. So the next question is, again, it's for Lee from Jania. I hope I pronounced that right. In the consultative group, one of the stakeholders was communities. Can you elaborate on this? Was there anybody formalized, like a stewardship or lake association, who is representing that community group?
That's a good question. That varies quite a bit across the different tables. So at many of the tables, there would be a group of some sort, like a recreation association or a conservation group, something like that, and they would nominate a member of their group who would then sit at as a member of the consultative committee. There were other times where there were just individuals who didn't represent a formal community, but who were sort of recognized as leaders in the community, and their opinion was, of interest to other people. They were sort of opinion leaders, even if they didn't belong to a formal organization. So we had several people like that who were involved. In some cases, we had local government involved, so there would be a representative from council of a local government as well. So it was encompassing a lot of things with that word communities. And
it sounds like there would have really been openness then, relating to what Kate was talking about knowledge coming from many different places, in terms of it didn't necessarily have to be a formal expert from the community.
Oh, absolutely. That's right. I mean, we had it was the people who were affected, and there had to be a sense that they represented a group of people who had similar concerns, and were recognized. Because one of the things that the members of the committee did was go back to their constituency or their community or their organization and share what was going on at the table. So, yeah, there was sort of it was very inclusive, and people came from different backgrounds. They certainly weren't all experts by any stretch of the imagination. And we were trying to get a representative group at the table while still staying with the size of the committee to a reasonable number that you could actually make progress at each meeting.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lee. So a question here from Patrika, interested in watershed planning, particularly due to an interest in crises in the Skeena River, interested in whether there are watershed use plans in northern BC at the moment. Patrika, that might be a question that we'll follow up on, as it's fairly specific, so we'll think it would be best for us to get back to you individually on that. If you could send me your email, then I'll hook up with you on that question. There's another question here from Janaya. Again, I really hope I'm pronouncing your name right, and I apologize if I'm not. And it's towards Kate Cave. She's asking, how do you reconcile the issues of power and legitimacy in using the plans developed by various First Nations communities in the overall watershed planning landscape? You have a case where both plans from a First Nations community and another water agency were implemented together.
That is a tough question. And I think that's an ongoing battle that First Nation communities are dealing with in terms of power legitimacy when they're developing plans, but that they're being respected and that they're being acknowledged and recognized and followed by other stakeholders and folks within their watershed plan boundaries. So I think part of how they're reconciling those issues is through a process of having stakeholders involved from the beginning. So for us, the first the first step is for First Nations to understand internally, which we talked about, what their interests are and what their goals and their vision is, so that they can be able to articulate that to other stakeholders within their watershed. And this includes understanding, their treaty rights and how that's impacted Aboriginal rights and their traditional laws and values and protocols, and being able to share that with other stakeholders, and then having other stakeholders on board and building those relationships, and then building something and creating a plan that will be sustainable and that will be followed. And that's easy to say, and I think as more First Nations develop plans and as more people start working together on that and collaborating, then there'll be that understanding, and then it'll be respected. But I know there's a lot of action going on in BC, so who knows? I mean, some First Nations may decide to take a different approach to that. I don't know. And I don't have a case off the top of my head where a First Nation community and other water agency have implemented together, have created different plans and implemented them together.
Thanks, Kate. And Janaya's followed up there. She's looking forward to continuing this discussion at Watersheds 2016. So for those who don't know, Kate's leading a session at the upcoming conference, and we'll be really focusing on these questions. So I think that conversation there picks up on a comment that Roger Brown is making. He's apologizing. He's had to leave the meeting now, but just wanted to pose something for the group to consider. He says, I think it is important to decide when to analyze and determine the extent of Aboriginal and treaty rights and seek consensus on their interpretation before getting into the trade-off and values discussion. In some instances, it would be less desirable to contemplate trade-offs when meeting those treaty rights and interests is paramount. So I think that picks up exactly on what you were just saying, Kate, so thanks, Roger, for that comment. I'm getting the prod that we are reaching the time where we have to wrap up for today's discussion. So I think we'll leave it at that, and any further questions, please do direct them to me at my email, which is research@polisproject.org, and I'll be able to either help answer them or direct you to one of our speakers today. We're looking forward to the rest of our Blue Dialogue series, which will continue this season with an additional 4 webinars, and we'll be in touch shortly with information on the next event. And for anyone who doesn't get our invitations and would like to receive them in the future, please send a note to myself or my colleague Megan, and we can add you to our mailing list. With that, I think I'll wrap up today's discussion, and thank you again to Lee and Kate for sharing their knowledge. It's hugely appreciated. You're welcome.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.